This is a very odd place to show this film. Because as I see it, there's this central idea at the core of this film, an idea that's almost impossible to recognize, let alone talk about here in our nation's capital. And that idea I want to suggest is an idea of equality. Now, it's actually, I think, hard for most Americans to talk about the idea of equality. There's so many contexts in our life that are ravaged with inequality. And it feels kind of embarrassing, almost hypocritical, to live in this world of endless inequality and talk about an ideal that seems nowhere around us. But I'm not someone who believes that equality is something that has to live in every sphere. I don't believe in absolute wealth equality. I think talents are unequal. I love my wife more than I hope you do. I want that inequality to be sustained. Yet I think there is a place that we have to celebrate an idea of equality that we can't be embarrassed about, that is at the core of the fight that this film was about. It's at the core of the fight that network neutrality is about. Even though I think sometimes network neutrality advocates miss this point. The fight over network neutrality is a fight over inequality. The internet was architected. It had an architecture that was designed to be simple or stupid, which meant it didn't have the intelligence to discriminate, which meant that content and applications were equal. And the consequence of that stupidity, that inability to discriminate, that equality, was a certain architecture that embedded innovation, enabled a certain kind of innovation. Think of the great moments of innovation in the history of the internet. Netscape, started by an undergraduate who dropped out from college. Hotmail, started by an Indian immigrant. ICQ, the first instant messaging chat, started by an Israeli high school student. Google, Napster, YouTube, all started by people under 30. Kazaa, started by a Dane and a Swede. Facebook, by a Harvard dropout. Reddit, by, in part, a Stanford dropout. Twitter, by Jack Dorsey when he's under the age of 30. What is it that unites all of these different innovations? It's that they are produced by kids, dropouts, and non-Americans. Outsiders, equally outsiders. Because the internet invites innovation equally. Now, this is a point that Aaron got. The internet was equal, which means we would get better innovation, better speech. But the truth is, Aaron cared for the internet for much more than the internet. Because ultimately, Aaron really wasn't an internet kid, or Aaron wasn't just the internet's kid. Aaron was a democracy kid. He was engaged in a fight to create a certain kind of democracy. And to me, when we think about him, I think it's this idea we have to put first. That was certainly who he was to me. As you saw a bit in that film, it was about 8 years ago that he came to me with a question. He said, as I described, how are you ever going to address the problems you care about so long as there's this fundamental corruption in this place, in Washington? And I told him, you know, Aaron, this is not my field. And he said, yeah, you mean as an academic, it's not your field? And I said, yeah, as an academic, it's not my field. And he said, okay, but how about as a citizen? Is it your field as a citizen? And this is the way Aaron was. His questions could speak as powerfully as a child's hug. And it was that question that shifted everything that I worked on, forced me to give up this work that I was doing. He and I started this group called Change Congress. We were focused exclusively then on this question of making this republic work. But the corruption that he spoke of, I think it's a different sense of what we typically mean by corruption. He wasn't talking about corrupt people, the William Jeffersons, the Randy Duke Cunninghams, or at least not just them. It was a corrupt system. And it was corrupt because the system denied this fundamental sense of equality and equality of citizens. You know, it's astonishing to me how hard it is for people, especially people here, to see this corruption and to acknowledge it. Astonishing how hard we work to deny it, because we're very quick to see it everywhere else. Think about the protests in Hong Kong at the end of the summer in response to a law proposing the method by which the governor, the chief executive of Hong Kong, would be selected. China said the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. So they were describing a two-stage process, nominating process and then an electing process, with a filter in the middle. The nominating committee was to be about 1,200 people, which out of a population of 5 million meant about 0.024%. Remember that number, 0.024%. That's a really, really tiny number. Right? If this were the average Hong Kong citizens, 0.024% is represented by that one tiny dot in the center of this 4,125 people, 0.024%. So this system of asking that tiny number to select the candidates who then everyone else would get to elect triggered a strike because people in Hong Kong said this was a biased filter. The 1,200 were dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. Martin Lee, the chairman of the Democratic Party of Hong Kong, said, "We want genuine universal suffrage, not democracy with Chinese characteristics." Chinese characteristics. But is this really Chinese? Because my view is this is not Chinese at all, unless Boss Tweed was an ancient Chinese prophet. Because Tweed said, of course, famously, "I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating." Right? Tweed understood the nature of power, corrupted power in a democracy. We can call his system Tweedism. And when we think about Tweedism, we think about this two-stage process with a biased filter in the center. We understand that bias is bias because it denies equality. It denies the equality of citizens. Of course, you won't be surprised if Tweed is an American. There is Tweedism in America. The most famous, infamous example, of course, the Old South, after the 15th Amendment granted African Americans a right not to be discriminated against, at least males, in the right to vote for 100 years. Okay, I'm exaggerating. For 95 years, there was a concerted effort to exclude African Americans from the right to vote. Texas, most ambitiously, by law, had an all-white primary. Only whites were permitted to vote in the Democratic primary. Only whites, which meant that they, too, had a two-stage process, general election where all citizens got to vote, but a white primary where only whites voted. You had to do well in the white primary to run in the general election. A two-stage process which excluded, in the critical first step, a critical part of that population, with the consequence, obviously, that the democracy was responsive to whites only. This is Tweedism, too. And it's not the last and maybe most important example of Tweedism in America, not the last example of this inequality. Because think of the new America. We take it for granted that campaigns are privately financed in America, and that funding takes time. People around here spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as they do this, as they dial for dollars, they learn what works. They develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not in issues 1 to 10, but in issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she came here, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green, And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now, B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance that it needs. We need to understand this is a picture of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson learns to push the buttons he or she needs to get the sustenance his or her campaign needs to survive. And as they do this, as they live this two-stage process where the funders vote first to fund the campaigns for the candidates who wish to be elected by the people, there is a filter here that is biased because of who the funders are. In 2014, 5.4 million Americans gave at least $1 to any political campaign at the federal level. That's about 1.75% of America. But the top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million. The top 100 gave 70% of the super PAC money that was spent in that election cycle. These are the funders. But when we think of all these funders, of course, there's a small set of these funders who are the relevant funders. People who give enough to be noticed or whose views will matter to congressmen as they think about which shift they ought to shape-shift into. So how do we draw that line? Where would you draw that line? Well, there are lots of places we could draw it, but here's one interesting implication from the last election. If you take the number of people who maxed out to at least one person, gave $5,200, that turns out to be 57,854 Americans in the last election. 57,854 Americans is 0.024% of the voting population of America. You remember that number, 0.024%. In the first stage of our election, even if you think something as small as $5,200 is the relevant line for relevant funders, we have equally as tiny a fraction of the 1% dominating this first stage, with the consequence that we produce a democracy that is responsive to the funders and maybe to the funders only. Extraordinary study by Princeton, which I'm not allowed to talk about Princeton studies, so I'll put it off the stage very quickly. Last year by Martin Gillens and Ben Page, the largest empirical study of political decisions by our government in the history of political science, relating those decisions to the views of economic elites, organized business interest, and the average voter. The economic elites, as the percentage favoring the policy goes from 0 to 100%, the probability of the policy being passed goes up. The highest is at about 38%. With organized business interests, it's about the same relationship. The higher the percentage, the more likely the policy will get adopted. But here's the graph for the average voter, a flat line. A flat line. What this says is, regardless of the percentage of average voters who favor a policy decision, it doesn't change the likelihood that that policy decision will be adopted. There is a flatline relationship between what the average voter cares about in this democracy and what our government does. As they put it in English, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. And the consequences are well known. Bard professor Pavlina Chernova made this graph of the distribution of average income growth between 1949 and the last recovery. She divided it between the amount of money that went to the bottom 90% and the amount that went to the top 10%. So what this is saying is, in the first cycle, 1949 to 1953, the bottom 90% got 80% of the growth. The top 10% got 20% of the growth. Here's the graph over time. What this is saying is, in the most recent recovery, the top 10% got more than 100% of the growth. The bottom 90% fell worse off than they were from the last recovery. And as Hacker and Pearson argue powerfully in their book, Winner Take All Politics, that change is because of changes in government policy. And as I try to argue in my book, Republic Lost, those changes in government policy benefiting the rich are because of funding that comes primarily from the same people benefited. This is Tweedism again. Thoreau said, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. To one who is striking at the root, we need to recognize this inequality is the root. Every wrong, every single wrong that we can pull from that film that's not tied to the irrationality of fear from terrorism, every single wrong is tied to this inequality." If Aaron were here, he would be pressing us to make this fight our fight, this fight against that inequality. And as we see the rhythm of this internet take off, the rhythm of activism in the context of this internet, we need to recognize that the giant is waking up. The internet has called it back to life, and as we collect the victories that are increasingly manifesting themselves with the power of this infrastructure, SOPA, the most dramatic and most powerfully just around the corner, the victory over network neutrality, we need to see this is the direction the fight needs to take. It's the direction that Aaron's life took too. From geek to citizen, from code to law, from copyright to a fight for equality. The only civil rights fights that ever win, indeed, the only civil rights fights that always win, are fights for equality. And this has got to be our fight now. Now let me end with one reminder that ties this together. It's 50 years ago tomorrow that Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered in Marion, Alabama. Jackson was walking with others in Marion to recruit people in Alabama to register to vote, African Americans. And at the time he was walking, the percentage of African Americans registered to vote in Alabama was 1%. And the reason African Americans were registered at such a low proportion was that there were questions on the registration form that only African Americans had to answer because whites were grandfathered in. And the questions were questions like, name all 67 county judges. Or when was Oklahoma admitted to the Union? Or my favorite example, how many bubbles are there on a bar of soap? So Jimmy Jackson was in Alabama fighting for the equal right to vote, and he was murdered. And after he was murdered, James Bevel, the director at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, tried to find a way to turn that tragedy around into something inspirational that could revive and unite a people furious at the murder that had just happened in Marion. And he announced a march from Selma to Montgomery. And it's 50 years and 10 days ago that that march started. And as it came to a bridge, it came to a bridge in the consciousness of America too. As Americans saw who America was, and the fight for equality became something that people in the North could no longer ignore. Now, I can't believe that as they started that march, they believed that violence was possible. They had fear. But I don't think they believed it because they were idealistic too. They were indignant because they had an idealism about the equality America promised, and they were fighting for it because they believed it could be achieved. But as they were forced to accept the reality, to suffer the indignity, they built a movement for equality. They didn't have the vote, an equal vote, so they walked and they protested and they fought for equality. But here's what we have to realize. We need to recognize we don't have the vote, an equal vote. I'm not talking about the ballot election. I'm talking about the money election. I'm not talking about in the general election. I'm talking about in the Green primary. We don't have the vote either. We have been denied the equality that an equal representative democracy promises. This must be our fight too, because this fight we can win. It is hard to see the inevitable. It is especially hard to see the inevitable in places like this. This is literally the last place in America that will rediscover the core ideal of America. An ideal uttered by a white guy as he defined the essence of this republic. Madison in The Federalist told us we would have a government that would be dependent on the people alone, but to clarify, in Federalist 57, he said, by the people, he meant not the rich more than the poor. Not the rich more than the poor. Madison was a geek. He was a geek uttering the one ideal of equality that we have forgotten as we fought for racial and gender and sexual orientation equality. Equalities they did not believe in, they did not embed. The one they did believe in, we have forgotten. We need that equality back. We need it back now. We need it back finally. Because if we don't, then the promise of this republic is gone. This inequality is the core. We all must join this fight, not because it's our profession, even if it's the profession of some who are here, but because as a citizen, as Aaron said, this is our job. Thank you very much.